All right, Krishna, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to take a look at the 12th mantra of the Sri Isopanisad. We are on the 13th part of this series, including the invocation and now 12 mantras. That's 13 parts total. So if you haven't listened to the previous episodes, I recommend starting from the beginning. That way you'll get the most out of this. But yeah, let's continue on with our study. It's been a little bit. I have gone for a good portion of the summer. So if you've been waiting around for this, thanks for your patience. All right, so back to the Sri Isopanisad. Now remember, the Upanishads are the ancient philosophical summaries and commentaries on the Vedas, which are the revealed scriptures of ancient Hinduism. Now, the Sri Isopanisad is the Upanishad of the Lord. Isha means Lord. It was written in poetic verse, and it consists of 18 verses. And this is, I've kind of lovingly called it the Bhakti Upanishad. So today we're going to look at the mantra 12, and you can read along in this book that I've mentioned a bunch of times already. The translation by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the monk who brought Bhakti Yoga to the United States in the 60s, started the Hare Krishna movement. Here is mantra 12, and you can feel free to read it aloud with me. Those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter into the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshipers of the Absolute. Let's read it one more time. Those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter into the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshipers of the Absolute. This is an interesting verse. When I first read it, I was like, geez, this sounds kind of harsh. You know, it sounds a little, I thought that the demigods were, you know, part of the universe, and they're gods, then they must have some, you know, place in divine creation. Why are we slamming them? Or, you know, something like that. Also, the worshipers of the Absolute, aren't we? Isn't this whole book been talking about the Absolute God? And aren't we supposed to worship God? So what is this one about? Well, it takes a little explaining. So let's look at the purport from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He writes in one portion of a really nice purport. He says, definition of the Absolute by negation is not a complete concept. Such negative definitions lead one to create a concept of his own, and one then imagines that the Absolute must be formless and without qualities. But these negations are simply the opposite numbers of the relative forms and qualities, and are themselves therefore relative. By such a concept of the Absolute, one can at the utmost reach the impersonal effulgence of God known as Brahman, but one cannot make further progress to the stage of Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. Let's read that one more time. Definition of the Absolute by negation is not a complete concept. Such negative definitions lead one to create a concept of his own, and one then imagines that the Absolute must be formless and without qualities. But these negations are simply the opposite numbers of the relative forms and qualities, and are themselves therefore relative. By such a concept of the Absolute, one can at the utmost reach the impersonal effulgence of God, known as Brahman, but one cannot make further progress to the stage of Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead. So what is this all about? Well, in Bhakti, we say that God is variety. God is found in variegation. So sometimes there's this idea that God is just a kind of impersonal, formless, light or something like that, or that God is an energy that is beyond all forms, and that God is therefore undifferentiated, pure oneness. In Bhakti Yoga, we don't believe that that's the case. We believe that oneness, or the undifferentiated quality of God, that kind of oneness aspect of God, is just one aspect of God, and that we also say that it is inferior in a sense, not worth less than, but it is in a sense not God's superior form. God's superior form is personal because God is a person, meaning not necessarily a human person, but God is a person. Just like we say your dog is a person, or your cat is a person, or I'm a person, that we say that the goal in bhakti is not the attainment of this undifferentiated, impersonal, absolute kind of beingness, or pure undifferentiated oneness, or something like that. For us in bhakti, it's about developing a loving, intimate, personal relationship with the personality or the personhood or the being, the actual personal being of God. And therefore, we look at creation and we see that God is manifest in and through many different various energies, expansions, and forms. And we recognize those as divine and not less than some kind of pure, undifferentiated white light or something like that. So that's really important. What Srila Prabhupada is saying here, back to the verse. Remember, the verse says, those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter into the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshipers of the absolute. What the verse is referring to are those that worship this idea of an undifferentiated, formless, impersonal God. A God that goes beyond form. That when someone looks at the world and they see all the forms of the world and they say, yeah, all of this is just an illusion and God is just pure oneness beyond all of this ignorant illusion. That in Bhakti we say, no, just like this world has various forms and energies, that God is like that too. And that God is also a personal being and not just some undifferentiated white light. That I'm also a personal being, you and me and everything. And that relationship with the divine being is the point of Bhakti, not merging into like a white light. So in the Bhakti Upanishad, the Sri Isopanisad says that, people who focus on God as though God is, beyond everything that we see, all the beautiful variety is the spice of life, right? Spiritually speaking, that's true too. So if we can see that God is present in all the different forms in creation, we start to see that God is variety, God is diversity, God is many and not just one. And then we can also recognize at the same time that God is a being. And just like we're beings, we're not trying to annihilate our beingness and again, merge into a white light. Now, at the same time, the verse is telling us to be careful about worshiping demigods, which is interesting. Why? Well, at the same time, we have to recognize the source or essence of God's energies and forms and not remain attached to any one of them as though any one of them is, like, for example, sometimes people will get this idea, and this is present in many different cultures around the world, that like, well, I better worship this one particular God, and we'll get attached to like one particular God. And that God, oftentimes in the demigod culture of India, would be worshipped specifically in order to maintain or bestow boons or blessings upon the individual in material terms. The old world, of astrology too, like we pray to the gods so that our crops might grow, or that we might have a bountiful harvest, or that we might have good health or something like that. So it's also not enough to recognize, oh, hey, there's these gods and we can pray to them and they can kind of like bestow us with things or provide things, or we might be afraid of them and so we try to propitiate them. And like that kind of relationship to the demigods is also not the answer. That we need to see that, yes, there are these demigods and they may have control over different facets of life, just like the planets do in astrology, but that we recognize that the divine person behind all of it, the divine being behind all of it, and that we water the roots of the tree rather than trying to water the branches. That would be the equivalent of worship of the demigods, as opposed to recognizing that we worship their source. We might have a relationship with the demigods, but we worship our bhakti yoga is focused on developing a relationship with the supreme person, the supreme being. Now, while bhakti recognizes God in all diverse energies and forms, the practice is still about directing love, devotion, and service to the supreme being. So that's what that verse is about. And it's really not some kind of, not slamming the demigods or something like that. Obviously, they're servants of God that's how they're depicted in the Shastras as well. Now, the Bhagavad Gita further reiterates this point in the 7th chapter in the 20th verse. Says, this is Krishna speaking, those whose intelligence has been stolen by material desires surrender unto demigods and follow the particular rules and regulations of worship according to their own natures. So in this case, it's like we might align ourselves with different kinds of gods or planets or whatever, because we're saying like, there's certain things I want or I don't want. And so I develop different relationships with the planetary deities in astrology or something like that. And again, Krishna is saying that this, usually this is reflective of people whose intelligence has been stolen by their desires. So they're not relating to God in the sense of God being the ultimate author of all things and a supreme being that wants individual relationships with us. Similarly, the Srimad Bhagavatam has this verse that I really like. It says, this is from the third canto, the 15th chapter in the 43rd verse. When the breeze carrying the aroma of tulsi leaves from the toes of the lotus feet of the personality of Godhead entered the nostrils of those sages, they experienced a change both in body and in mind, even though they were attached to the impersonal Brahman understanding. This is a really nice verse. It's saying, here's tulsi leaves. Have you ever smelled tulsi? We in Bhakti, we offer tulsi to Krishna. Tulsi is always with Krishna, serving Krishna's lotus feet in the scriptures. And so we say, here's these sages that are totally entranced in the undifferentiated oneness of the Brahman, samadhi, right? They're kind of in that like sort of impersonal, everything is one trance state, they're meditating. And they smell the leaves of tulsi coming from the toes of God, coming from the toes of Krishna. And their minds can't help but be attracted to it, which is to say that there is a higher attraction than even that of the impersonal, undifferentiated oneness. And that, because that oneness is really just the light coming off from the body of God. And actually, but there is an actual being called God, and we can have a relationship. So we say that's Krishna, and we talk about Krishna very personally throughout the study of Bhakti, specifically so that we can feel and smell that aroma ourselves, and that is the ultimate attractor, and that's also what really changes our hearts and makes us the capable of really loving others and of loving all things. We have to recognize the individual within all things, a cat, a dog, a tree, a person. How can you do that? Well, we start by smelling the aroma of the tulsi leaves, coming off from the feet of the highest person, who also wants to have a very intimate personal relationship with us. So these verses are very deep verses, and they are provocative, and they may not make the most sense to us in a certain way because we didn't grow up with like demigod worship as a cultural experience here in the United States. We didn't grow up with, maybe some of us grew up a little bit more familiar with people sort of worshiping this idea of oneness, but obviously in Bhakti the idea is to awaken the individual personal soul. We have to have the personal relationship with the actual highest person. So that's the conception behind Bhakti. I hope you enjoyed this verse. Stay tuned for verse 13 coming up soon. Hare Krishna, everyone. Bye.